I'm Sheila Kavanaugh. I'm professor of English at Emory, and I'm thrilled to welcome you for this event this afternoon. This event is a Rosemary McGee creativity conversation, and those of you who have the privilege of meeting Rosemary know that she has instigated many important conversations during her time at Emory, and this will be no exception. This is also being sponsored by the Hightower Fund, by Oxford College, by the departments of history, English, and theater and film. And the last time that Harry Lennix was here was for the Year of Shakespeare, and that was before Emory was fortunate enough, we now have in our department T. Cooper, who is an executive producer for the Blacklist. So we have even a stronger connection with Harry Lennix than we had before. So I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but I'd like to start by introducing Clint Fluker, who is the curator of African American collections at Emory. And for those of you who have not been to the Rose Library, you are really missing out. So I strongly recommend, and I know earlier when I mentioned this, Clint said I was stealing his wind, but I'm gonna do it again. For example, right now we recently got the Bram Stoker collection. So I'm teaching a class on Bram Stoker. And Clint brought a series of books to show my students on Wednesday on Afrofuturism. It included a vampire story written by Alice Walker and another vampire story written by Pearl Cleage. So there are vampires all through this building. Please be cautious. Do not remove any of your neck gear, but do go to the Rose Library when you have that opportunity. And I'll now turn things over to Clint, and then I will introduce our speakers.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome to the Woodruff Library. And I work at the Rose Library, which is on the 10th floor. Again, my name is Clint Fluker, and I'm the curator of African American collections. And I thank you, Dr. Kavanaugh, for that wonderful introduction. You don't steal my thunder, it's okay. No, and I also want to thank Dr. Andrews, who sat on my dissertation committee. So I'm glad he's here as well. Thank you, sir. And I want to thank and I also want to thank the guest of honor, Harry Lennix, for coming today as well. This is a really special occasion because we get the chance to speak to an artist in conversation to understand how they do what they do and also how they contribute to humanity through not just their artistry, but also through the creation of a museum in this case. This is a major opportunity for us because when you get to talk to someone about it, you learn so much more than you would have just by reading it in an article or looking at it on YouTube. We're here in person, and I'm grateful for all of you for coming here today. As the curator of African American collections, it's my job to tell you how dope our collections are. So that's what I'm here to do. We have some amazing collections on the 10th floor of the library here. We collect Black print culture. That includes the rare books, that includes the newspapers, of course, that includes ephemera. But we also have writers, we have artists, we have organizations, all of this spanning across the history of what it is to be African American in this country. For example, we have the SCLC administrative papers. We have the C.T. Vivian, Octavia Vivian papers. We also have the work of Alice Walker, not just the vampire concept. She did a few other things. But we also have a long history of performing arts and collections in that area. We were just upstairs with Harry Lennix, and we were looking at the papers of Carmen de Lalibelade and Jeffrey Holder, for example. We weren't just looking at the whiz, we were also looking at some of the storyboards, the sketches that went into these plays. We have the work of Pearl Cleage, as we said before, and we're looking at the scripts, the manuscripts of Flying West, and the diaries that went into the development of that amazing, amazing play. We have the Jim Alexander photograph collection. So we have images of African Americans playing instruments, putting on plays, going to protests that go from 1960 all the way up into present day. Hundreds of thousands of images in this way. So the point of mentioning all this is to say that not only do we have the collections, but we want to share those collections with you, and we want to do that through the exhibitions. There's exhibitions on this floor featuring the archives all throughout the library. There's documentaries, there's podcasts, there's a variety of different ways in which we reach the public with these collections because they're for you. They're for you to engage with, to hold, and to touch. And this is one of those programs where you get to talk with someone like Harry Lennix and Dr. Dwight Andrews about the development of this kind of work. It's not that these amazing people like Harry Lennix come out of a vacuum. There's a process that leads to this kind of work, and the archives help us illuminate that process. So today, again, I thank you for coming. I thank these wonderful people for being on stage and talking to us. And thanks again, Dr. Kavanaugh, for giving me a moment to talk about how awesome our stuff is. All right, y'all.
I'm really delighted to introduce both of our participants in the conversation today, who the two of them met initially in 2008 when they were involved in putting on the entire cycle of August Wilson's plays at the Kennedy Center. Dr. Dwight Andrews was music director for August Wilson on Broadway, sort of like you do. He's on our faculty, he's professor of music theory and African American music. He's also the senior minister of the First Congregational United Church of Christ downtown, where he was co-minister for some time with Andrew Young. So he's kind of one of those underachievers, but he has done a lot on stage, on film, on television, and most importantly, he officiated at my wedding. And as we were pointing out earlier today, my husband and I are still married. So this is not a bad thing, And we give Dwight Andrews full credit for that. Harry Lennix is here today partly as the co-founder of the new African American Museum of Performing Arts in Chicago, which you are going to hear about. He's also a very accomplished stage and screen actor, both television and film. If you are not currently watching The Blacklist, it's just been renewed and you can catch up on it. We heard earlier this afternoon that he recently got a phone call from President Bill Clinton saying he just binge watched the entire thing. So if President Clinton can binge watch The Blacklist, so can you. He was also in Man of Steel. He was in The Matrix, which I assume that some of you have heard of. He was in 24. He was Aaron in Julie Taymor's Titus, and has done a couple of African American Shakespeare versions, Romeo and Juliet in Harlem, and Henry IV, which is set in Watts. And he has some other classic works that are in process from an African American perspective. So today we've got Dr. Andrews and Mr. Lennix discussing a creativity conversation about all the amazing things that they're working on. So please welcome them and thank you very much.
Make sure I have this thing turned on.
Mine is on, yeah. Although I don't need it. I don't really need this in this room. I'm a well-trained actor.
I hope you can all hear me. Good. Well, this is a wonderful afternoon for us to have this conversation, to be with my dear friend Harry Lennix, colleague. I think this creativity conversation is exactly what what we need in these times when messages are oftentimes short-circuited and put into sound bites. To get a chance to have an open-ended conversation with you, Harry, is a great honor for me, and it's a great honor to have you on this campus. So I wanted to begin as kind of your interlocutor by kind of taking a wide view for a moment, at least, because we're living in such a complicated time. And I think one of the things that all artists are asking themselves is, how do we best respond in our respective lanes to this moment? And I'm just curious, a two-parter. How do you see this moment, and how do you see yourself in this moment as not just actor, but director, producer, thinker, creative person? How do you bring yourself to this moment, if you would?
Well, thank you, Dwight. It's of course a great honor to be back with you. We have had the opportunity to make music together in the past, and this is a kind of extension of music making, thinking about ideas. Dr. Kavanaugh, Sheila, my dear friend, thank you again for this invitation. Great to be with you here at this beautiful campus. Thank you, Clint, for taking me around the archives. That was very inspiring, and I think that's and great to see your father again. The great Walter Fluker, my person introduced me to the works of Howard Thurman, and I think all of it in some way, as a person, as an actor, as an artist, I find myself I'm very much into synthesis. You know, in philosophy and so forth, science, people talk about analysis vis-a-vis synthesis. And I've always synthesized things better than I've been able to analyze them, although that's a deeply important part of the work that you and I do as, I would say, as experts in our respective fields. But the moment that we find that I think that we are in, nationally, perhaps even internationally, there's this great sense of unsettledness. You know, I think people always in the moment think of things as unique to it the first time this kind of existential moment has hit us, but that's not true. There have been times like this, so even 100 years ago, coming out of the pandemic in 1918, after the war and all of these things that led the way into the roaring 20s and the huge burst of creativity really that spawned in places like Harlem, for example, the Renaissance, as they called it. And then, of course, in the 60s, the birth of the Harlem arts, the Black arts movement that Amiri Baraka so coined, and these things. And I think that this is another such moment. It happens, it's generational, I think, on some level. But I think in this time, we have the ability to look back on what has worked and what has not worked. I think as a man of the faith, Dwight, you and I think can look at this moment as critical for, in particular, Black people, because I think that Black people have abandoned, to a large extent, or at least these new generations have seemed to abandon the reverence for the divine and the sacred, God, religion, what was once the bulwark of the Black community. I think it was Calvin Butts who once said that there is no separation of church and state in Black America. But I don't think that that's true anymore. Now there seems to be a quite deep division of church and state, and we've seen what it has wrought. And I think that that is a kind of general deterioration of what people call the inner city. I guess they think that's euphemistic, but whatever that is, even in the places in the South. And I think we've seen a great failing on the part of the church to really deal with it. I think, of course, there is good reason to have been cynical about government's role in it, the academy's role in it throughout these last several decades, or at least the last few, the way that I think of it, where it seemed that there was more cohesion when I was in college, for example, in the 80s, as a community kind of idea. People have rallied behind a kind of Black Lives Matters thing, but I'm not even quite sure what that means. It's such a reductive phrase. But that said, I think that where church has failed and government has fallen short, those are interchangeable accusations that I'm making here, that there's really the place where culture can come in. And I think that my response for this in past, whereas I might have gotten political about it, having once been the head of the Black Student Union at Northwestern and so forth, I think now the only answer that seems satisfactory in any way is creativity, is culture. Inherent to Black culture is God. It is the stuff of it. Inherent to governance and kind of self-control, if you will, libertarianism, if you will, is Black arts culture. And so it struck me walking down the streets of New York that you could go within a mile and see the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, Birdland, Carnegie Hall, all of these places that exist in pretty close proximity, but it's everywhere. In any given night on West 3rd Street, I could walk into a bar and listen to live jazz, before the pandemic certainly, and now once again. And that there had been some semblance of that in a place like Chicago, but there is no longer. I mean, there's 95% of the theaters in Chicago are on the north side. The 5% that are on the south side are very few of them are run by any kind of Black leadership. But it seemed to me that it would be a perfect opportunity to put back what was once there, and that in which absence, all kinds of things, despair, a general lack of morale, a general lack of any kind of rallying cry that was something beautiful that people could look at. There's such a lack of beauty. And I think that's the greatness that we talk about, this idea about creativity in itself, this genius of creativity that very few people really have as a percentage, or at least have yet not had the opportunity to unlock. Because I believe that in those schools on the south side of Chicago, where I grew up and went to school, and even though it was a Catholic education, having studied to be a priest and all of these things, but I could walk down the street and hear gospel music. The guys who were in the Shy Lights lived in my neighborhood, a guy by the name of Eugene Record and so forth. Muhammad Ali lived not far away. The Nation of Islam was deeply entrenched in that neighborhood. My neighbors, we played all summer. They were in school all summer. And just seeing the kind of, the need that was created for a form of expression, the way that we talk, the way that we move, the way that we dance, the music that we listen to. I remember, Dwight, and this is getting far afield a little bit, but I remember the first time I heard gospel music, I was on a bus with my mother, and Oh Happy Day came on. I was like, what is this music? What is this music? Because I was into singing Gregorian chants and learning all these really boring Catholic songs. But being inculcated in that neighborhood, being ensconced, let me put these aside. It provided answers. It gave me a kind of bearing. It gave me a sense of location and a sense of place in a spiritual way, as much as it did in any kind of geographical sense. So, what did the Lincoln Center do that was ingenious? Well, there's this little housing project in the middle of the city. John Rockefeller bought some land up and decided to give a home to already existing institutions, such as the Metropolitan Opera, such as Juilliard. I guess they were, I think they were probably in existence. Jazz, and, American Ballet Theater, all of these places had existed. But what Rockefeller had the foresight to do, even though he rarely partook in entertainment, was to give it a central home. And that's what I'm trying to do with this museum and performing arts center. I'm going to more than try. We are going to create something that should have long been in existence. It's shocking to me that there is no such museum or performing arts center for the only original indigenous art forms in the United States, which is Black dance, music, culture of that nature.
So this all begs a question. I mean, you've taken me in a place that I really didn't anticipate that we would go, but now that you've opened that door,
Yes.
both in terms of the failings of the church, which was that core institution in which culture in so many ways, music, dance, oratory, all of it was a part of what we might call the Black church experience. But if the church has abdicated its role, is the museum, I guess I'm trying to figure out how we connect what you describe as a kind of spiritual acknowledgement to the creative and aesthetic acknowledgement, because the church, in a sense, does that. And can you recreate that in a museum or in the museum that you envision? Because in some ways, Lincoln Center is a great example of how arts in America is driven not just by money, but by race and a kind of canonizing certain kinds of expressions over others. So you can see the need for the museum that you're going to create. But will that give us a way to recapture that spiritual thing that you described that has been so much a part of your understanding of who we are as a people? Or where does that, how do we connect those dots?
It's a great question, one that I think in some way maybe doesn't need an answer. That is to say, I think it's a self-contained answer, that you cannot separate God from Black culture. I don't see how it can be divorced, decoupled. I think that the reason for its existence was a relationship with God, and then of course influenced by more Europeanized concepts of God and Christ and so forth. But that was all taken in to the kind of gumbo that is Black life, and so I don't think that you can get it out. And I think that the great thing about it is that you can, in some way, we can, without ever mentioning God, demonstrate God. I think, there's when I was in at school studying sociology, such as it was, somebody once said, maybe in a book, that in certain languages, there is no word for God in certain African languages, because it's self-evident. It's there already. And so I don't think that it's a heavy lift. I think that the curation of what is on display there, and gets back to one aspect of your question. What separates this from any other museum, it's a museum for the performing arts. And so those exhibitions that would be on a shelf like upstairs, will be on a stage or in an auditorium of some sort. So these are living arts. Now, they'll be chronicled and archived, and now we've got these magnificent machines that can tape everything, but so much in our culture has been lost because nobody ever bothered with, for example, this is crazy, but I understand that Walter Hawkins's archives are available. I know the guy who represents them. Why is that not someplace? Why is that not at that Smithsonian thing? But that can't have everything. It's already, you know what I mean? It can't do everything well.
Right.
But that then leaves the burden on guys like you and me.
Or the opportunity.
The opportunity to fill that in. But I think that this is not going to be a religious organization. This is not going to be denominational in that sense. It won't have, won't prefer Christianity over Islam or Judaism or what have you. But God can exist and persist through all of these forms. I don't see how
it
he isn't in.
Yeah.
Right.
So let me ask you, many of us didn't know that you had studied theology and studied to be a priest, I understand.
Yes.
I never quite got that far in my theological education to be a priest, but one, what got you there? And two, what helped you to see that perhaps the priesthood was not necessarily a part of your journey? I'm selfishly asking because I'm curious.
I think what got me there was a knowledge, somehow a kind of awareness of God. I go back, it wasn't quite this, but I go back to the book of Samuel when, and he says, hey, somebody, did you call me, Master? He says, no. It happens 2 or 3 times, and finally says, next time say that, Lord, I'm listening. This is, Samuel. It was kind of like that. My father died before I was 2, and my mother tells me that I would go up into the living room and what we call the living room, and talk to his picture. And then one day I came back and I said, I know where my father is. He's dead. And I never went back up there. And I don't know what happened in that moment. Nobody does. I can imagine, though, that some divine or some superhuman communication occurred. Some information was exchanged. I'm not going to go into how I think that might have looked. That's really the stuff of the actual creations that we produce. But something was communicated. Some information was transmitted. And so after that, I had every intention of following through with that, and being a young Catholic boy and calling these men in collars father, and thinking that perhaps I could be that for somebody like me who didn't have a living father or what have you, but that you could stand in the place of a father, and loco parentis, I guess they would say in law. And so that was it. And then I think insofar as what got me out of wanting to become a priest, her name was Anita Blanchard. And she was she was the most beautiful girl in the world. She's married now with 5 kids. She's a doctor, head of the OB-GYN department at the University of Chicago.
Okay.
But yeah, she was going to Northwestern, and I was already in the seminary going on. And so I was like, why don't I look into Northwestern? But that didn't happen. It never happened. But it was the old bait and switch, so to speak.
Okay.
Yeah, somewhere on a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. So yeah.
So this is fascinating. Anita, huh? Okay. We'll come back to that on the side. So you are doing so much in the business. I mean, you're a stage actor, you're a director, you're a producer, you're conceiving new projects, dealing with content in new ways. But I think for many of us who are not as familiar with the business, I'd like you to describe, even if it's just for a moment, kind of the nexus between the business and art, because they're not always the same. At least I don't always think they're the same. But from your perspective, since you've been very successful in the business, yet and still I think you have a very kind of high benchmark in terms of how you conceive creativity and art. How do you negotiate the two realities of movie business, film business, with being an artist and an actor and creator of content?
This is fascinating. We have a saying, which the biggest part of show business is business. And I think that that's true. I don't think that you can be, there are those people who in the early part of their careers really sort of labor in the live theater, knowing that it's not going to be very lucrative. There are people that I knew, came up with in Chicago, guys like Steve Pickering, a wonderful actor, who just wanted to be a stage actor. He's done movies and so forth, but he really loves the theater. I was never that, in all transparency. I wanted to be known. I wanted to be, Anthony Hopkins says he always wanted to be rich and famous. I wanted to be perhaps not famous, but well regarded, known as somebody that could hold his own with anybody. And that's always been very important to me, but I knew that I would not be able to do these things that I'm trying to do now if I would just remain local and sort of lived under that glass ceiling for the rest of my life in Chicago. That it would take a kind of, I reject the, who was it, Thomas Mann or whatever, you can never go home again, you can't go home again? Oh yeah, I'm blanking. So somebody said that. But I don't think that that's true. And I think that what's really true is that you never have to leave home, even if you're living in another city. And if you maintain roots that you can, and keep your finger on the pulse of what it is that you want to remain engaged with, the source from which we spring, I think that you can go home. it was Jesus who said, of course, because a prophet is never accepted in his hometown or whatever. But I'm not a prophet. I'm a showman. And I think if you put on a good show, the people will come. And you have to let the people know that the show is there. This is the hardest lesson I've learned in the last 12 years, Dwight, is I produced a few movies, tried to get money raised for those movies. You know that my brother Lamont over here knows well what's about Andre Lamont. But I put my own money in it, and you can make it, the movie, it could be a great movie. But if nobody knows about it, it's as if it never happened. And so now my real focus is on, well, when I start to think about creating something, I think automatically is how do we finance it and how do we distribute it? That's the last great detail, is the distribution of these properties. And it's a really tightly knit group. It's hard to get in there. You need millions and millions of dollars to play, or you already need to control the mechanism that can put it out there. I am greatly encouraged by the democratization of the internet, and I think that as soon as somebody eventually will figure out how to solve that problem, it's really just a matter of time, but as of yet, we have not been able to do it. But I never tried to, I was never a purist in that sense. I don't think Shakespeare was. You know, people think of, now they think of Shakespeare as some sort of high-minded thing that's for elite people, but that was never true.
Yeah, he was a writer.
Yeah, it was a writer. He
Again,
liked them all. He liked everybody.
Yeah, that's fascinating. When we were upstairs in the Rose, I got really excited in the conversation between you and Clint, because I think the work that you're doing right now and the kind of work that's going on at the Rose really presents a really unique opportunity, since the world is clamoring for content. You know, every movie house is looking for new content, and we've all seen how far that content or how deep that content is or isn't. But when you guys were chatting about the possibilities of thinking creatively about content and the rich archive at the Rose, where there are all kinds of things that we don't even know about, that could be represented not just in a museum for a kind of curating purposes, but presented as a part of a living, performing art. I just got very excited, because I think this is one of the ways that the university will find the way out of its own silo by mining the materials that it has archived and set aside and put away, and you can't see it. But here you can touch it, you can read it, you can see all of the ancillary materials. And then when you bring a creative person like yourself to it, you can see the possibilities, looking at a handwritten script by Pearl or so many other kinds of resources. So I think that's an exciting part of the future, because I do think we have to do some institution building, and the institutions don't build themselves. And if we're concerned about African American culture and an African American future, then you have to be concerned about the institutions that will further it. So this is very exciting. Can you say a little bit more about where the idea of the museum came from, and how in the world are you going to do it?
Yeah, well, yeah. The idea was, I think the idea first came to me, it must have been 2007. And the need for space, for example, for a theater existed in Los Angeles. There's a group called the Roby Theater Company, named after Paul Robinson. And it's run by a guy named Ben Guillory. And Danny Glover is actually, I think it's co-founder, was a co-artistic director for many years. Of course, deeply trained, they came up together at ACT, I believe. The one out in San Francisco, whatever. Yeah, I think that's where it is. In any case, they needed a theater, and they were always downtown, and it smelled, reeked of urine whenever you went into the theater building, because it's a lot of homeless people and so forth. So it seemed to me that they needed a building, and it would be great if they had it in the hood. And then I'm on the board of a group called Congo Square Theater Company in Chicago. They've been around for like 25 years, started by a couple Howard graduates. All due respect to Clark Atlanta and so forth. There you said. No, but that's. But these guys came out of Howard, and they started this theater company, which is still doing well. And the woman who co-founded AMPA with me, her name is Teron Patton, UCLA grad. She said, I want you to help us find a theater. I'm on their board. I said, okay, well, yeah. But it occurred to me that if it was good for one company, it might be good for very many companies. All of the theater companies on the South Side used to have physical buildings, such as the Chicago Theater Company, which was in a Hull House, Chocolate Chips, Kowumba. ETA still has a place, but it's greatly antiquated. And then there's another one, the name which is escaping me now, but there are a number of older theaters. It's called the Harold Washington Cultural Arts Center or something. Huge place, 1,000 seats. I don't think that whoever designed it knew nothing about building a theater, sadly. And then the other ones were, built in the 70s and these kinds of things, wholly inadequate. And so as I saw friends of mine in places like Brooklyn building theaters that cost 50 million, 70 million, these kinds of price tags, price points. But it wasn't so much what it cost, but what those theaters could do, what they could house, how flexible they were, how accommodating they were, how modern, how the instrumentation, these things, people who know how to build theaters for certain functions. All of the renovations that were made in places like David Geffen Hall, the way that these Meyer panels that people can put, all of these innovations that were not being used in theaters that sort of did not exist on the South Side of Chicago. And so I thought, well, it would be great then to have an entire complex, a campus, much like the campus of Lincoln Center, where we could house and take residencies from already existing institutions. At the same time, be able to educate, to inform, to apprentice these up and coming people. We used to have, Sheila, in the old days of Shakespeare, before there were things like directors and there were apprentice actors, there were apprentice dancers, people who learned their craft on the job with the masters of the form. In jazz, Dwight, you guys used to go and do cutting contests. You'd be wood, shredding, wood shopping all night. And that we should be able to do that now. And again, we're the catch-all of those who are in a curriculum at a school or whatever, I don't necessarily think that you have to or should have to go to college and study something that you don't want to do if you can apprentice under equally great masters in a place like this. So that's really how the idea got started. Now, this is not, thank God, entirely of my own devising. I've got I got a huge team of people around me, and they're coming up with ideas all the time. And so as they give me these innovations that are happening, the musicians that I know, the young prodigies and so forth, then it keeps getting built upon. So fortunately, the state of Illinois, at least it's in the budget, they have not approved this budget, but they have granted us, or they're going to put in the budget for a $26 million help. The city of Chicago for some $5 million. And this will help us not just to build out the Performing Arts Center, the Lily and Marcy Center for the Performing Arts, named after my mother and my mentor when I was a school teacher. Marcella Gilly was the principal at that school. But an entire supporting facility where the artists going to stay, when they're in town performing, where are they going to get a good bite to eat? Where are the people going to have the dinner and the show part? There's nothing in that area. It's like a desert over there in large part. Who's going to build the sets? Where are the people going to rehearse? Where's the office space going? So it needs more than just one. We're already over capacity. And so much of this is invention by necessity. They say that necessity is the father of invention. Yeah. Well, this is something that we deeply need. And again, I think it's going to be, and I've said it for a long time, this is an answer to prayer, even a prayer that one is not aware that one is praying. But put it back, damn it. Yeah. It was there, you took it away. Disease, deterioration, lack of morale, all of these things followed in its absence. But nobody noticed. It's like taking, removing a fresh air granting big oak tree from the middle of a park,
Right.
and then it becomes a two-pipe skating rink thing. You're going to get a lot more carbon dioxide. You're going to attract the kind of people that are not, for example, the ones that might ameliorate the neighborhood. But I have seen everywhere they put it, in places like Brooklyn, when they built Theater for a New Audience, my dear friends. The city of New York, by the way, gave them $35 million of their $70 million. Because they knew the value, and as soon as they put it there, here comes BAM. As soon as they put it there, here comes Barclays Center. The place that had the fourth most available real estate residentially in the country, Brooklyn, one borough of New York. Now you can't afford it. Get over there. You can't get a seat at a restaurant because where art comes, culture comes, life, vitality follow.
Yeah. That's a very powerful sermon, and what you describe is, in its own way, a community building, not just the actors, not just a performance place, but all of the pieces that bring people together to an experience is what you describe. That's very powerful. I want to switch gears just for a moment because I know we're going to make some time for people to ask questions, but I'm curious, given your training, your experience, can you just comment a bit on the training for our young thespians? Is it changing? Should it change? Everybody doesn't get a chance to go to Juilliard or to the Yale Drama School. What's different and what's needed? I'll put it that way. Because, and let me just be transparent, several of my Hollywood black actor friends are always resenting who's getting hired for these black films because so many people, they say, are coming from England. Is that because they're trained? You tell me what's going on in the business side of where the brothers and the sisters are.
Yeah, well.
Uh-oh.
I'll just straighten this. We sure did. Yeah, as a matter of fact, we did discuss it. There's no good reason that that British actors are running around playing black icons, black American icons. No good reason for it. In fact, all bad reasons. I think perhaps it's a price point thing, a kind of perception. A lot of us are Anglophiles in some way, thinking that when they hear that accent or the fact that that they can make that go away to some extent when they want to. It's some sort of magic trick. But this is I describe it in a certain way as it's like putting on a mask only to take it off. Like you don't need some British guy playing Dr. King. There's 1,000 actors in the city of Atlanta that could play it, or any number of other of these iconic figures. The same girl played Coretta Scott King twice, I think, in 2 different movies. Why? Why? But that said, I think that the training in the schools throughout the country is quite good, and it doesn't have to be Juilliard or Yale or NYU. Of course, is fantastic. Columbia is great in Chicago and in New York. Places throughout Florida, here. In Atlanta, there are so many good actors, so many great actors out there doing tremendous work. I see them all the time, and so I don't know what that is, but I think it's a smoke and mirrors game. They're blinded by some lack of self-esteem and thinking that sometimes you have to go outside of your own community, your own pool, your own talent pool to find something that is better or and somehow more refined, but it isn't. It is not. I studied Shakespeare as much as those people, maybe more. You know what I mean? I can say the same, but the same training, that is to say, and I think the training is from not the technical point of view, but from the kind of emotive, analytic, processing way. Being in touch with the body, the kinesthetic kind of training and awareness that we have as Americans is superior. And so and that's in schools throughout the country. As generally speaking, goes along. There's the Stanislavski, basically the so-called method school, and people like Chekhov and Sandy Meisner and all these people fall within the kind of general silo of what the method is, which originally came out of the Moscow Art School. But that said, that's usually the template from which all of these schools draw. Now, it's increased a little bit, like NYU is doing this thing, I can't remember what they call it, but it's the kind of Chicago school method that they're using. Again, it is the method, but in Chicago in the 70s and 80s, there were actors like William Norris and other people who developed a kind of programmatic study of acting that they're using now at NYU, which is fantastic. There was a great journalist, theatrical journalist by the name of Richard Christensen, who wrote for the Chicago Tribune for many years, who wrote a book called A Theater of Our Own. And it kind of chronicled what the Goodman Theater, Steppenwolf Theater, Victory Gardens, Wisdom Bridge Theater were doing in the 80s and sort of establishing their own style, a kind of quite kinetic, almost brash, for lack of a better word, macho style of acting, a full throttle. People like Laurie Metcalf, of course, John Malkovich, people like that came out of that kind of school. And then, that was, most of them came out of the Illinois State University. So, there are these pockets of culture and of training, most of which follow along a certain, as I say, the Stanislavski school from the American point of view. In England, there's far more sort of technical, intellect. There's this great quote, Dwight, that I love, that Kenneth Tynan, the great English critic, once said of John Gielgud. He said he's the greatest actor in the English language from the neck up. I didn't even like that. Yeah. So, and so I find, it seems to me that is relatively descriptive of the kind of British approach. Of course, there are very many wonderful actors from there and all over the world, but I don't think our preference of them is well-grounded, I would say.
I know that Sheila's getting ready to cut us off, but I just want to ask one last quick question. So paint me a picture 5 years from now. We'll reflect that we were all sitting here talking about your museum and your work. Paint me a picture. Where is Harry and what is Harry doing 5 to 7 years from now? I know we're going to do our project, I hope, within the next 7 years. But paint me a picture in the 2 minutes that Sheila's going to give us.
I think 5 to 7 years from now, I'll probably still be on the Blacklist.
Let's hope so.
Just a very quick codicil, there's lately, people keep talking about elected office, and I think about it sometimes, but I'm not sure if I have the stomach for it. But if I'm not doing the Blacklist or that, I'll be running this theater. That is, not even running it, but going out, sourcing things that can go to it, and sourcing places where stuff that we produce there can go. And I would love for, as we talked about earlier, a great exchange with Emory would be fantastic. We send things and we bring things, and that would be that'd be great.
Thank you so much, Harry. You're my man. You're my man. Thank you, brother.
Thank you. Always great talking to you.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. With the discussion about where people are trained and such, in Atlanta, we are extremely grateful for Harry's coterie from Northwestern. When he was studying at Northwestern, he was studying with Laura Cole, who's education director at the Atlanta Shakespeare Tavern. He was also studying with Susan Booth, who is artistic director at the Alliance Theater. And he came from there. Unfortunately, there were also some people who didn't do very well afterwards, and he sadly was a classmate of the forlorn Stephen Colbert. But at least some of the other people succeeded. We've got time. Isn't that true?
It is true. In fact, interesting little thing. In 2005, Colbert he was the keynote at the White House Press Correspondents' Dinner. And I was there, and I was the only person in the room who was laughing. And so I was howling because I thought it was great. So after he finished his bit, I go up to the stage, and I hadn't seen him since graduation. I said, Steve. He said, Harry Lennix, what the hell are you doing? I said, man, I just watched you were great. And Carl Rove and people were roving about it. He said, man, I don't think these people liked me. And I said a word that I won't use here, but blank these people. He tells that story too, by the way.
And if you go on the web, you can look up Stephen Colbert's impersonation of Harry Lennix.
That's right.
So we've got time for a couple of questions. Yes, please.
Okay, so you are Chris Rock
Right.
in the Oscars, and you say your joke to him.
Right.
Okay, and then he comes up and does whatever. Okay, a smack or whatever. I call it a pimp smack.
That's
Okay,
what it
a
was,
pimp slap.
Yeah.
I thought it was a punch, but it was that.
Right.
So you are Chris Rock. You're up there. You're MC, and he comes up to you. What would you do? How do you respond? What do you do? And then also like your take on it.
Okay.
Okay. What are you gonna do?
So do you want to go first?
Let me go first,
Yeah,
because
okay.
I think that Harry is going to give a much more evolved answer than me. So let me go first. I'm from Detroit, and I would not have taken the tact that Chris Rock, and I give it to him, that he had the composure to respond in the way that he did. So that's the first thing. It would have been a very different, very from the neck down response, because I'm from Detroit. But on another level, and I think Harry will give a much more evolved response, and I knew somebody was going to ask about Chris Rock and Will Smith. But on another level, from the pastoral point of view, I read that moment as being not about Chris Rock, not about the joke, not about her short hair. It was about something else going on with Will Smith. And when people are triggered in that way, out of the blue, in that kind of situation, there's something else going on. So that's about all I want to say without kind of going any further. But I think that was symbolic of something else. And I hope that everybody will ask themselves what that was. So that's my response.
And I understand that somebody, a famous actor, wrote a piece in Vanity Fair today.
Variety.
Variety,
Yeah,
sorry.
right.
Variety.
Yeah. So that's true. There's an article just got published a couple of hours ago, or you can probably find it. But it's what I think about it. So that's a far more, as Dwight said, an evolved response. But I think your direct question was what I would have done. I don't think this hypothetical would have, it is hypothetical, but he wouldn't have gotten up there with me because, you know what I mean, because I'm bigger than he is. And had he done so, and this is true, and I'm glad that neither of these happened. These two events happened. But that evening could have only, when I saw it, I thought to myself, this can only end in one of two ways. Somebody's dead or in prison. That's an affront to which, look, if it happened in, Victorian England or any, the honor that was desecrated in that moment for the ceremony itself, for the man himself, for all the other people involved in it. It was such a desecration that I believe it created what I call an existential crisis. It's deeper than the slap. And so I think that until it is atoned for and properly addressed, we'll continue to ask these questions and wonder what could have possessed this man. But I say in this article, of course, that people were ascribing this to as an act of God. Denzel Washington, with his dime store theology, said it was the devil made him do it, and so forth. But that was not the devil, nor God. No divine entity was in the building that night that had anything to do with the course of events. And so I think like Dr. Andrews said, that it is emblematic of a deeper pathology, which needs immediate help. And that the only decent thing that can happen, since the Oscars, of which I'm a member of the Academy, since they won't do it, the only person that can have any decent act at this point is Will Smith by returning it and declaring, which is true, that he does not deserve it. and that he disqualified himself by his action. I make the comparison, you'll read it. But if a police officer went into a bank and robbed it in front of cameras in the middle of the day, and then the next day got the Policeman of the Year award, it would be absurd. And this was equally absurd.
Interesting.
This side of the room from Detroit too, so from the waist down, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question. Theater question. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, was it the early 90s you did Julius Caesar with Jumanji? Did you do?
I directed it, yes.
And we had it's fabulous, the Nation of Islam and the Panthers.
That's right. That's
Great.
right.
I love doing that. My MFA is in acting and theater. I've taught for over 35 years. I like taking, as my students say, dead white men's material and bring it back to life and make it relevant for a contemporary audience. I set Jean Moliere's Tartuffe in Harlem and made him a jackleg preacher, and it didn't change a word, just change the costumes, the setting, and have a creative imagination. And she spoke about a couple of projects that Shakespeare projects that you have. I have a question. When I see us, and you know who I'm talking about.
Okay, yeah.
When I see us do the Bard's work, don't change a word, but just bring our essence, bring our soul, bring our culture to it. It is absolutely stunning that I've seen, including your production of Julius Caesar a few years ago. What is it? What do you think it is? What is it?
Well, it's a very good question, and I say that from a kind of historical point of view as well. I would make the case, and Sheila, I was going to do something rather more academic. I'm not an academic, obviously, but I think that there was a time when you could make the case that the only Americans of note doing Shakespeare in New York, certainly, and therefore the rest of the country, no doubt, were Black people, with the African Grove Theater Company, which was around the early 19th century, or late, whatever it was, the early 19th century. And of course, we know what happened. They were doing a production of Richard III when their theater was burned because they were a threat to the commercial viability of very near theaters. This is before Broadway, of course, down in the Village. The theater was burned, they were arrested and not let out until they promised not to do Shakespeare. So I think that there's something about the physical structure of the language, the way that the iambic aspect to it, the kind of natural rhythmic patterns of it, the hermeneutics involved with it, that is a kind of natural fit for, just as I was talking to when Sheila and I first met, there was a guy by the name of, was it Cherry? Professor Cherry, who I was talking to him about opera singers such as Jessie Norman and Shirley, there's a woman, Shirley I can't remember. Shirley Barrett, who, and I was like, what is it about the physiology of the Black, body that kind of gives a different, and special resonance, if you will. And he opined as to certain other things, but so something I don't know enough about it as a scientist to talk about it, but there is a connection there that I think is in part spiritual and sort of, but also that is mechanical, that is purely physical, that we have this affinity, I think, for it when given the opportunity to do it. And I think to your point in terms of placing it, contextualizing it, making ourselves visible within it, I think when we do that in intelligent ways, rather than, for example, the old idea of color-blind casting, when sometimes you look at these things and you're like, well, this just doesn't make sense. I'm looking at these families that just don't add up. I think well-intentioned, But these kinds of movements we can trace them back to like 1982, 1983, when there were conferences held as how to get more inclusion and so forth. But I think the answers 40 years ago need not be the answers that we rely upon now. And that our idea of classicism, that what is classic and how it can be approached, that we have far more data now, far more availability for training and inclusion that we can actually make sense in a better way.
That actually, and I assure you that I do not know this woman. She is not a plant in the audience, but I can tell you that tomorrow afternoon at the Atlanta Shakespeare Tavern, Sammy Byron, who is here from Shakespeare Behind Bars, and after you watch all of the Blacklist, you can stream Shakespeare Behind Bars, which I highly recommend. But he is doing his one-man show, Othello's Tribunal, which integrates his life experience and Othello. We're going to be showing clips from Harry's Shakespeare movies, and then we're going to have a moderated discussion about Shakespeare and the African-American male experience. So it's going to be at 2:30 tomorrow at the Shakespeare Tavern. They will open at about 1 o'clock and have lunch for sale if you'd like to go, but do please join us. No, that's why I said you sounded like a plant, but I think it's going to be a wonderful experience, as this was wonderful. I thank you both so much for being with us this afternoon, and thank you all for coming. And there's a rumor going around that there might be cupcakes for you in the hallway outside this room. So please enjoy, and please thank our speakers one more time.